We're finally here. I have been putting off making this video for a long time, but we have finally reached the moment where I talk about my top 5 favourite novels of all time. Why now? Well, because I've got a really bad cold and I thought this might cheer me up. Here are my top 5 favourite books ever, I think. Because I'm changeable. But I thought about this a lot. These are the 5 I came up with. I have ranked them. They are in order. And we'll start with number 5. His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Now, this is a trilogy, and I am really just talking about the first one, which in the UK is called Northern Lights, and I'm pretty sure in the US and maybe other places, I'm not sure, it's called The Golden Compass. Northern Lights, the first book in His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, is one of my favourite books ever, but I have to admit, I often kind of forget that because this was the novel that got me into reading as a teenager. I enjoyed English class when I was at school, and I enjoyed the plays and the poetry and some of the books that we studied. But when I was about 15, when I was in year 10 in secondary school, a friend of mine told me to read Northern Lights, and for some reason, I listened. I did. I read it. And I finally understood how reading could be fun, how it could also be thought-provoking, how literature could be complicated, but also inspiring, especially to the imagination. Northern Lights gave me everything I needed to flip a switch in my brain and help me at age 15 understand the magic of reading. I have so much to thank this book for. It's a young adult novel. When I read it, I was a young adult. I was also a very angsty, anti-theistic teenager, running around saying, screw Christianity, I hate religion, blah 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 blah. I was a very punk rock kid who hated organised religion, and these are borderline anti-theistic books. Philip Pullman is a known humanist, and this trilogy is very critical of organised religion, especially Christianity. At 15, I really needed a book like that in my life to help me make sense of my angst towards religion. Not only that, but it is such a glorious, gorgeous adventure story. It takes you to so many wonderful places, and growing up I loved fantasy, but this is urban fantasy. It takes place in a world similar to our own, but different enough to be magical and beautiful. It's a world that feels a little bit Victorian, a little bit steampunk, a little bit magical, a world of speaking animal companions, and I was a very lonely teenager. The idea of having a demon of my own really spoke to me. I could list off 100 things that this book does that I needed exactly at the moment that I read it. And I reread this book about a year ago, and it still holds up. It is still a magical, exciting, enthralling adventure. Philip Pullman isn't the most adventurous writer. His books are kind of rigid and they do what they need to do. His language isn't particularly playful, but his stories and characters drive the plot forward. Lyra is also one of the most lovable, likable, and charming characters you'll ever read in fiction, and I formed a kinship with her when I was a teenager, long before my egg cracked, that I will forever be grateful for. Northern Lights will forever be one of my favourite novels because of what it did for me. But it is the only book on this list that is on the list for that reason. Every other book on this list is a book I read as an adult and formed an appreciation for in a more contextless way. Like, I love this book because of the context in which I read it. It came to me at that exact time, and often that's the case for a lot of our favourite things. If you now think about your favourite book, film, TV show, video game, whatever kind of art or media it is, it might well be your favourite because it came to you at a specific time. It got you through a difficult period. It got you into something, reading, video games, whatever it is. It's something that you loved as a child, something that almost acted as a parent and helped raise you. These are all typical reasons that things are our favourites, but this is the only book on this list that is there for that reason. Everything else, I love it because of what it is. And I'm not saying that that's not true for this. I do love this for what it is, but the context is important for this one in particular. Number 4 is Little by Edward Carey. I read this book a little under 2 years ago. I read it over Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and it was an experience I will never ever forget. Before finally reading this book, I had heard about it. It had been on my radar. Edward Carey seemed like a great author for me to discover, but something clicked in me that told me I had to read it then and there. At Christmas, while visiting family, this book was a blanket. But as I said, every other book on this list is not about context. It is about the quality of the book itself, and Little provides me everything I love in a good work of fiction. Little tells the story of the girl who would eventually become Madame Tussaud. She was born Marie Groscholz, and for most of the book she is simply referred to as Little. And this is a fictionalized biography of her life. She was born in 1761 in Alsace, and we follow her around Europe, mostly within France, but also to Switzerland, Germany, back to France again. She lives through the French Revolution, and we watch her grow up. We watch her move through tragedy. As a very, very young girl, she watches her father go off to war and return very, very disabled. And the things that she sees once he returns, and the death that shortly follows, all of this informs where her life would go, the things that would intrigue her, that would fuel and inspire her. Once her father dies, she and her mother are taken in by this strange, reclusive man. He's a doctor, an anatomist, and he teaches Little about the art and science of anatomy. He creates hyper-realistic waxworks of people for science, and she becomes obsessed with it. She is curious. Soon after, her mother dies, and she's still only 6 years old. And from there, she and Dr. Curtius will have a master and apprentice, maybe kind of father-surrogate-daughter relationship, and they will travel far and wide as she learns, as she grows, as she becomes curious, as she faces more tragedy. This is a Gothic tale, a wonderful work of historical fiction, a fantastic and inspiring biography, and it's also full of sketches. All the sketches you can see here are done by Edward Carey, and they litter this entire book. I can't tell you how much I love Little. A work of Gothic, historical, adventurous biography about an inspiring but traumatized young woman. It's perfect for me. It gives me everything I love. At number 3 is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. It is a masterful work of dark academia, and it is so adept at crossing the borders between genres. As I said, it's dark academia, but it's also a very interpersonal drama and a very, very compelling murder mystery story. If you love The Secret History, this gets compared to that a lot, but it's also an Agatha Christie-esque crime drama, and it's also a love letter to Shakespeare and the people who love Shakespeare. M.L. Rio is a student of Shakespeare, and this book is so much a dedication to the art of studying the bard. As someone who studied a lot of Shakespeare at school, then at university, then became an English teacher, and taught a lot of Shakespeare to high school kids for several years, this book gives me everything that I want with respect to my academic interests, to the work that I have done as a student and teacher of Shakespeare. And I love crime, I love thrillers, and once again, this is absolutely a Gothic book. A fantastic work of dark academia, and good dark academia is always Gothic. We begin with a man called Oliver Marks, who has been in prison for 10 years for a crime he probably didn't commit. When he was at university, he and a group of friends studied Shakespeare at an elite college. They spent all their time reading the bard's works, performing his plays, rehearsing together, and hanging out together in an almost incestuous way. This was a very small, close-knit group of friends who spent every waking minute together, and they lived and breathed Shakespeare to such an extent that they throw out random phrases from various Shakespeare plays at every opportunity. At the dinner table, when they're sitting around at parties drinking together, when they're in bed together. These people are Shakespeare's children, laughing, playing, studying, working, and f***ing together. It is wildly toxic, it is so much fun, and you know that at some point one of them is going to die, and Oliver Marks will go away for it, but is that the truth? Halfway through this book, it becomes a murder mystery. And if you love dark academia, if you love Shakespeare, if you have a respect for crime fiction, this is all of that and more. It is even greater than the sum of its parts, and I love it to pieces. If you've been a fan of my channel for a while, the top two are not gonna surprise you. Also because I don't disguise my books in my thumbnails, so you already know what they are. At number 2 is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, translated from the Japanese into English by Ginny Taple Takimori. I love this book more than words can say. It is my favorite Japanese novel. Sayaka Murata is my favorite Japanese author, and although her other works are more horror tinged, and I do love horror fiction, this was the first one I read. It was the first one of hers a lot of people read because she is now an international sensation and she deserves to be. I've forgotten what I was saying. This remains my favorite because of how I saw myself in it, but also something I've never really expressed before when talking about this book, and I have talked about it a lot, is the fact that I am kind of afraid of what I see in this book. See, this is the story of a neurodiverse outsider who has found a way to survive in society peacefully, harmlessly, and yet that's not enough for the people around her, the people who engage in and commit to the system that governs us, a system that we all happen to be born in and we all just have to take part in. What, because I was born now, I have to do the things you say, I have to go to school, I have to get a job, I have to pay taxes, I have to blah, 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 just because I exist now? It is frightening and absurd that we cannot escape the system purely because we exist within it. It makes my head hurt the more I think about it. And for so many neurodivergent people and people of various minorities, mere existence is difficult, complicated, frightening, and almost undoable. And Keiko reflects all of that. She is an autistic-coded woman who is in her mid-30s and has spent about 18 years since she was a teenager working at a convenience store. In Japan, convenience stores exist on every street corner. There are about 5 big chains, and they really are everywhere. And Keiko has been working at a convenience store for more than a decade, and she is just going to continue doing that because it's a world she understands. She does the job, she does it well, she knows what to expect every single day, she's gotten her work down to a fine art and a science. And this means that she can survive. Life is hard, the world is confusing, people don't make sense to her. She doesn't want any of the things that people say you're supposed to want. A partner, children, a mortgage, to go up a corporate ladder and make more and more money. She doesn't understand any of these things, she doesn't want them. She wants to just survive because life is hard enough that she can't ask for more. She doesn't even understand the idea of asking for more. She's found a way to live, and throughout the novel, people tell her that that's wrong. People criticize her, people are confused by her, even scared of her, and I feel so much for her. I cry for Keiko. As a neurodiverse person myself, I understand her. I'm self-employed for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons is that I have ADHD and maybe probably OCD as well. I'm looking into that. Living in an ordinary world is really hard. It's confusing, it's exhausting, and it's depressing. I escaped regular work. I'm terrified of the idea of having to do it again. Maybe one day on the horizon I'll have to get a regular job working for someone else. Like I don't work for Google and YouTube now, but you know what I mean. I see so much of myself in Keiko, but as I said, I'm also kind of afraid because Keiko doesn't do much and she doesn't want to. Whereas as someone with ADHD and also just having the personality I have, I'm eager for the exact opposite. I have 1,000 hobbies, 1,000 interests. I make money from like 10 different sources and I just pull it all together into something that allows me to survive. So in many ways, she and I are kin, but we are also opposites, and that's often the case with different kinds of neurospiciness. She is almost definitely autistic, and I have ADHD. In so many ways, those two things are very similar, and in many others, they are complete opposites. And so I see myself in her, but her rigidity and lack of diversity within her life, the things she does, the way she behaves, her day-to-day life, it frightens me because I am constantly seeking new and diverse forms of stimulation and entertainment. I want every day to be different so that I constantly feel like new things are happening. Mundanity frightens me. And so I am frightened by her existence, but I also sympathize so much with how she feels and how she sees the world. And I've gone on for a while. I think you can see how much she has affected me in the 5 or so years since I first read this book. It's a wonder. It's an absolute wonder. And finally, my favorite book in the whole wide world, and I am very confident to say it always will be, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I have a Frankenstein tattoo right here on my arm. I'm wearing the wrong shirt for this. It was done by my friend Matt Daniels, who's a fantastic tattoo artist. Go follow him on Instagram, Sticky Pop. He's so great. I have 2 copies of this book. I have visited the House of Frankenstein in Bath multiple times. I've got a Frankenstein teddy bear. I live and breathe this book. Frankenstein, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest work of literature in the history of global fiction. It is a true masterpiece, a perfect work of fiction. It is generally regarded as the first work of science fiction. It is a horror novel, a story of monsters and revenge. It is the greatest work of Gothic fiction, and that is heavily to do with Shelley's exquisite mastery of the written word. And Frankenstein was also inspired by Shelley's relationship to her partner, Percy Shelley, the loss of her child, the fear of losing another child, her own relationship to her father, and the bitterness that she felt towards fatherhood and the fathers who abandon or don't care enough for their children. Victor Frankenstein abandons his child, and when he does that, even though he built this child piece by piece, limb by limb, he brought this thing to life in order to conquer death itself. He takes one look at the child and he runs, leaving his creature, his creation, to roam the world alone, confused, lost, and scared, to be chased, to be abused, and to become deeply embittered by the world based on how it treats him. Thus begins a revenge tale. But Frankenstein is also a wonderful adventure story. It begins with a series of letters from a ship captain who is stuck in the ice and sending notes to his sister, telling her about his journey until he finds Victor Frankenstein, half starved and half insane in the ice, explaining how he is part of a cat and mouse game with his own creation, and then he tells his story. The story of a young man who loses his mother and becomes incredibly arrogant, fueled by hubris. He creates a monster in a laboratory and abandons it. This is a book that is full of murder, vengeance, adventure, adversity. It is dark academia. It is so much, and it does all of that so perfectly. An incredible work of Gothic horror science fiction. Frankenstein is everything that I love, not just in literature, but in narratives, in fiction, in storytelling. I have written a dozen poems inspired by this novel, and how this novel has affected me personally as a queer and trans person as well. The transgender kinship that I feel towards this book is intense. And I only realized that when I started writing poem after poem after poem about this book or inspired by this book, and how it always comes back to me being trans. I can't stress enough the impact this book has had on me. Personally, academically, professionally, in every which way, this book has left its mark on me. Literally, I have. I don't know who I'd be without this book. I sometimes feel like my soul is in here. Frankenstein means the world to me. I love my partner, I love my cat, and I love this book. That's my family. I will forever be indebted to Mary Shelley. I also named my cat after her mum. I will forever love this book, and I could talk about it for 1,000 years. I finally did it. Those are my top 5 favorite books. If you enjoyed this, consider clicking this link and showing me your support. I would really appreciate it. Let me know your top 5 favorite books in the comments and subscribe for books.